Thank you again for joining us tonight. We really appreciate your time, your interest, and most importantly, your support. With that, I'll pass the floor to Nathaniel to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much, Ren. And thank you to all of you for spending your time with us this evening. We've got a lot of really interesting data about a crucially important state, the state of Georgia. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And just because I know, gosh, we've got a great crowd here, just because I know lots of people are still coming in, as a reminder, the way this evening is going to go is as you can see here. We will have a Q&A session at the end. And so if you have questions along the way, please put them in the Q&A folder. Ren may answer them as we go along, or she may not, and she might hold them for this Q&A session at the end so that I can answer them. But know that we're first going to start with a quick introduction to the Environmental Voter Project. This will be quick. If you are new to the Environmental Voter Project, you are probably going to want more, but please just understand that this isn't a broad introduction to what we do at the Environmental Voter Project. It's just a little bit to get you oriented for those who are new or need a refresher. And we'll provide lots of links for more in-depth information. The heart of this session is going to be letting you know what we have found in our voter file analyses of Georgia and how climate voters and volunteers and donors can make a huge difference in Georgia this year. I think we've got a lot of really compelling and interesting data for you, and my hope is that you'll really enjoy it. And then, as I said previously, we will have a Q&A session. So if you've got questions, please throw them in that Q&A folder, and we will get to them towards the end. So without further ado, let's get started. We've had a lot more people join us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And I'm going to start by telling you a teeny little bit about this nonprofit. In a nutshell, what we do is we find environmentalists who don't vote, and then we turn them into better voters. That's it. That's what we do. We find environmentalists who don't vote, and we turn them into better voters. What we do not do is endorse candidates or lobby for particular policies, or even try to convince people to care more about climate or other environmental issues. We don't do opinion-changing or mind-changing work at all. We don't want to convince people to care more about climate. There are other great groups that do that. Instead, we want to find the ones who are already convinced, yet they aren't voting, and turn them into consistent voters. And that might seem like a very narrow niche, but as I'll explain to you over the coming minutes, for better or for worse, it's a much bigger niche than you might imagine, and it's an enormously impactful one as well. The reason we focus in this particular area can be explained in large part by the data that you see in this poll. Now, this particular poll is a poll from the last big federal election, so the 22 midterm elections. It's taken of likely voters in battleground states. And they were asked, what's your number one most important political priority? Only 4% of them listed climate and the environment. 4%. Now, the good news is that's higher than we would have seen 4 years previous to that in 2018 or 2014. But the bad news is that's still nowhere near close to where we need it to be. And for those of you who are thinking, oh, Nathaniel, that's just one poll. Well, guess what the exit polls from the 2020 presidential election said? 4% of voters in that election listed climate and the environment as their top priority. In fact, any poll that you look at, whether it be for president or city council or anything in between, anywhere around the country, it might not say exactly 4%, but it's going to be somewhere around there. And the overarching theme is going to be far, far too few voters list climate and other environmental issues as a top priority. And this is a big problem for those of us in the climate movement. because this makes it extraordinarily hard to elect climate leaders. Moreover, even when we do elect good climate leaders, it isn't like they can just snap their fingers and get whatever they want done, right? No, they still need to decide what to spend their precious political capital on, and they ain't going to spend it on the thing that 4% of voters list as their top priority. And this lack of demand in the political marketplace is something that many of us in the climate movement don't want to face up to, but it is a crucially important problem to solve. And this is what we are laser focused on at the Environmental Voter Project. We see this problem that there are far too few voters who list climate as a top priority. And we realize there are really only two ways to fix this problem. One way would be to try to convince a whole bunch of voters to start caring more about climate change. But oh my God, is that hard and messy and expensive? And at the end of the day, you can't even really test that well which messages are working and which messages aren't working. But there's another way to try to tackle this problem, and that is to find people who don't need their minds changed, to find people who are already deeply convinced that addressing the climate crisis is of supreme importance, yet they aren't voting, and mobilize them to vote, nudge them into becoming better, more consistent voters. In other words, take a behavioral approach to it rather than a mind-changing or opinion-changing approach. That is the approach that we take at the Environmental Voter Project. And one of the big reasons we take that approach is not just because of what I said, that it's a little bit easier, but also because of the enormous opportunity that lies there. Because it turns out, although there might not be many voters who list climate as their top priority, oh boy, are there a lot of non-voters. Because it turns out the climate and environmental movement has a huge turnout problem. It turns out that tens of millions of dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists just aren't voting in elections big, small, and in between. And just to put some numbers on it, in the 22 midterm elections, 13 million already registered voters, they were already registered, who are likely to list climate and other environmental issues as their number one top priority, just didn't vote. They didn't cast a ballot. 13 million of them. If we go back to the 2020 presidential election, 8.1 million didn't even vote in that. The highest turnout presidential election in US history. And 8.1 million already registered, dyed-in-the-wool super environmentalists just stayed at home on election day and didn't cast a ballot. Now, many of you are likely shaking your heads thinking like, oh my God, why aren't these people voting? And I get it. I get your frustration. But what I'd like to suggest to you is that this is an enormous opportunity. Because as I alluded to earlier, we live in a moment in time where it's become almost impossible to change people's minds about anything, but especially climate change. And what these people represent are folks who don't need their minds changed. They care so much about climate and the environment that they're likely to list it as their number one priority. They're just not voting. They don't need their minds changed. They just need their behavior changed. And I won't claim that's easy. Of course it's not easy. But what it is easier and cheaper and measurable, because whether you vote or not is public record. So if we try to mobilize voters, we can set up experiments and then look at public voter files to see if they actually get certain people to vote and compare it to a control group and things like that. This is the approach that we take at the Environmental Voter Project. And it's very easy to describe by just breaking it down into 4 steps. Now, again, please bear with me. This is not meant to be a long introduction to our work at the Environmental Voter Project, so I'm going to breeze through these things so that people who are old hat to our game don't Don't get bored here. Step number one, identification. We work with data scientists to build something called predictive models. Now, if you're already thinking like, oh my gosh, this sounds complicated, I want to tell you two things. One, what I'm about to describe to you are the same tools that modern political campaigns use to target voters. So presidential campaigns, US Senate, congressional, gubernatorial, it's what they use. And then the second thing I want to tell you is, even though this is a very sophisticated approach to identifying voters, I think it can be broken down into a few simple ideas. The first is, we build these predictive models by first polling huge numbers of people. We poll like 10,000 people per state, but we can get away with it cost-wise because we're only asking them one question. We say, hey, what's your number one most important political priority? Let's say 1,000 of them answer climate change in Pennsylvania or Georgia. Well, then we can start learning everything possible about those 1,000 people, those people who just told us that climate's their number one priority. We look at voter file data. We look at census data. We look at publicly available behavioral and consumer data. And we start to learn a whole lot about these people. And then we start trying to find other people like them, other Georgians who are really close to this group or that group or that group that said that climate's their number one priority. And it's a long iterative process, but at the end of it, what we are able to do is assign a score from 0 to 100 to every single individual voter in the Georgia voter file, telling us how likely they are to not just care about climate and the environment, but literally list it as their number one priority over all other issues. And Ren will share some links in the chat, letting you know a little bit more about this identification process. We have a very short briefing, a video briefing on it, if you're more interested in some details. But what I can tell you is that when we test these models after they're built, they are shockingly accurate. Usually what we do is we isolate people who have a greater than 85% likelihood of listing climate as a top priority. And then we test that and we poll them and we ask these people again, please tell us what your number one priority is. Every single time we do that, at least 85% of the respondents say, oh, climate change. Why do you ask? That's how precise these are. All right, so we've isolated this group of climate first registered voters. Then we don't need fancy data scientists to tell us which of these people are likely to vote or unlikely to vote, because whether you vote or not is public record. It's public record. So we take these environmentalists, we get rid of the good voters, they don't need a behavioral intervention, and we just focused on the ones who are unlikely to vote, because we look at their public voting history and we can figure that out. Well, now we have this like almost magical list, right? We have this group of people who, like, you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change, but we know that they don't vote. And because it's on voter files, we know who they are by name and street address, and we have their phone numbers. And so that opens us up to step number 2, mobilization. And what we can do here is we work with thousands of volunteers, many of you are watching right now, to canvass and call and mail these voters with behavioral science-informed messaging designed to do just one thing and one thing only, and that is get them to vote. As a staff, we also run direct mail and digital ad campaigns. We run hundreds of experiments each year called randomized control trials that help us fine-tune our messaging so that we know which message to deliver over which medium to which subgroup of these non-voting environmentalists. Then step 3, habit reinforcement. You don't need to be a behavioral scientist. You don't need to live this stuff like we do every day to probably be able to figure out that if you want to change someone's behavior, you can't just talk to them once every 2 years when there's a big federal election going on. And so what we do is we work year round. And I know a lot of groups say that, but like, I really mean it. As just one example, just this year, just since January 1st, 2024, we have communicated with voters, I kid you not, in 137 different elections. 137 already this year. And that's not because all of them were important for environmental policymaking. I freely admit many of them had nothing to do with environmental policymaking whatsoever. But they all had everything to do with behavior change. Because if you're in the business of turning non-voters into voters, how dare you let any election pass you by without using it as an opportunity to communicate with your targets? And so we take habit reinforcement really seriously, using every election as a precious behavioral intervention opportunity. Because ultimately, our goal is step 4, and that is to change the electorate. We want to make it so that anybody running for anything anywhere looks at likely voters, looks at their voter files, looks at their polls, and they say, holy moly, where did all these environmental voters come from? Because when that happens, politicians will lead on climate, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but because nothing motivates a politician more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. And so that is why we are so laser focused on finding these non-voting environmentalists, using data science and behavioral science and thousands of amazing volunteers to turn them into more consistent voters. It will not only change who wins elections, but it will change the electorate and how policy is made. If you have more questions or want more information about what we do and why we do it, please go to our website at environmentalvoter.org/about. Very quickly, I'm going to run through some of our results. We test our impact in 2 ways. The first is our impact on specific elections. We do this through using what's called randomized control trials. Very briefly, let's say we identify 500,000 unlikely to vote environmentalists in Georgia. What we do not do is then immediately start communicating with all 500,000 of them. No, instead, before we talk to a single one of them, we randomly separate them into 2 groups. And you see, up here is a treatment, sometimes called an intervention group, and down here is a control group. Usually it's about an 85% split and 15% in the control group. And what we do is we set that control group aside, that group of low propensity environmental voters, and we never talk to them. Never. Then the remaining 85%, the treatment group, they're the ones who are canvassed and called and mailed and sent digital ads to, all with this behavioral science informed messaging focused on just turning them into better voters. Then the election happens. Now remember what I've brought up a few times already. Whether you vote or not is public record. And so a few months after the election, a magical thing happens, and that is public voter files are updated, and we can see who voted and who didn't. We can look in our control group of low propensity environmental voters and see what percentage of them voted. And then we can compare that to our treatment group, the people we did talk to, who are also low propensity environmental voters, and see how many of them voted. And if we've done this correctly, if this was a random separation process and the numbers are big enough to achieve what's called statistical significance, what this enables us to do is isolate how much we were solely responsible for increasing turnout while controlling for all outside variables. Like if it rained in Savannah and that depressed turnout, well, proportionately, the percentage of Savannah residents in our control group is just as big as the percentage in our treatment group. We've controlled for that. Or if the Biden campaign spends $1 billion mobilizing voters, well, we've controlled for that too. Unless they hack into our system and talk to people in our treatment group, but not our control group, we've controlled for things like that. And so what we've seen when we've done these randomized control trials, and we've been involved in almost 900 elections over the past 4 years, is that obviously in many of these elections, we're talking to such a small group of people that although we likely increased turnout, we can't prove that we were solely responsible for it. But in many of them, dozens of them, we can. And you'll see just in the 19 states that we're active in, and you can see them here, in 2020 and 21, and 22 and 23. we could see with statistically significant results that we were solely responsible for boosting turnout as much as 1.8 percentage points in statewide general elections, as much as 3.6 percentage points in statewide primaries, and as much as 5.7 percentage points in local elections. These are big numbers in this business. Big numbers. Finally, the last way we measure our impact is over the long term. Since we launched we launched a proof of concept about 7 years ago. We launched for good in 2017. We have now communicated with 9.5 million unique individual voters. And this data is about a year old. We're actually updating this data right now and hope to release it over the next week or two. But as of about a year ago, we had communicated with 9.5 million unique individual voters. And we had tagged them in our voter file. And by definition, they were all super environmentalists who were unlikely to vote in an election, or we wouldn't have spoken to them, right? Well, as of this time last year, almost 1.5 million of them had become such consistent voters that we could see in public voter files that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and even their most recent local election. They had become super voters. They had become such consistent voters that even if you were running for dog catcher, you would look at the voter file and you'd say, oh, yep, that person's going to vote. Let's go talk to him. Let's send a canvasser to their door. Oh, and let's poll them to figure out what issues they care about. This is how you really, really change how policy is made. And this is the metric of which we are most proud. Now, I do just want to mention one caveat. This is different from the previous metric, the randomized control trial. We can't claim that we are solely responsible for turning 1.5 million non-voters into super voters. In fact, we are not solely responsible for that. But we're pretty darn responsible. There's no other group that's been active in now almost 2,000 different elections since we launched 7 years ago. All right. If you want more on our results, we've got 1 billion reports and studies and lots of other data and graphs on our website at environmentalvoter.org/results. All right, let's get into Georgia, shall we? This is what you are here for. So I'm going to dive into a whole lot of the data we have found when doing that identification step. Remember, I told you about the first step of what we do, where we build these predictive models and individually identify super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote? Well, this is what we found in Georgia. We have identified, and this is after removing a control group, we've identified an absurdly large 491,000 super environmentalists in Georgia who are unlikely to vote on November 5th. As a reminder, the way we define this group, they have a greater than 85% likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their top priority. They are already registered to vote, yet they are unlikely to actually cast a ballot. And the way that we're defining that this year is they did not vote in 2020 or any election since then. Now, that might be a slightly over-inclusive number, that 490,000, because then what that also includes is some people were like 19 years old and they weren't even around and able to vote in the last presidential election. But if these people haven't voted before, we feel pretty comfortable assuming that they need a nudge to vote. All right, that's a huge number, but let me give you some context for how huge it is. In the last presidential election, only 5 million people cast ballots in Georgia. So what that means is our target population of low propensity environmental voters is so large that it almost equals 10% of all ballots that were cast last time there was a presidential election in Georgia. That is how huge this number is. This is a larger percentage of likely ballots cast than we see in almost any of our other states. And you don't need me to tell you how important Georgia is. Another important piece of context, as Donald Trump was fond of saying while being recorded over the phone, the margin of victory in Georgia 4 years ago was only 11,779 votes. And once again, we have individually identified by name and street address 491,369 of these super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote without a robust campaign mobilizing them to do so. All right, when we look at the landscape in Georgia this year, for the first time in a long time, we can say, hey, there's no US Senate race. So we got that going for us. Georgia is also so heavily gerrymandered that there probably aren't going to be many competitive, if any competitive congressional races either. But it remains crucially important for the presidency. And we're going to go through what we are seeing in various congressional districts and look at this population of low propensity environmental voters. Before we start doing that, though, I do just want to highlight this. Remember what I said before about how we take habit reinforcement very seriously? Well, one of the best ways to get people to vote on November 5th is to start talking to them now when there's less static. And so we already were mobilizing Georgians in their presidential primary. We were already mobilizing Georgians in special state legislative elections. And yeah, you better believe that on May 21st, we're going to be mobilizing these low propensity environmental voters in Georgia to vote in their state primaries. Because the simple truth is the only way to turn a non-voter into a voter is to have them vote in an election. And so how dare we let one pass us by without using it as an opportunity to talk to them and nudge them into becoming better voters? Because if we are able to do that, one, behavioral science experiments show us that they are then much more likely to vote again. But two, remember, whether you vote or not is public record. So if we get one of these low propensity voters to vote on May 21st in their state primary, it only then takes a few months for the record of them having voted to show up on public voter files. And then everybody who is anybody who is running for office this fall sees it, goes to their door, starts polling them, and mobilizes them. It's like we have then pushed these people into the marketplace of voters that politicians actually pay attention to. If there's one big takeaway looking at these big numbers, and we're going to try to drill down into them in a second, it's this. The number of voters we are targeting at the Environmental Voter Project in Georgia is so large that it is almost 42 times larger than the margin of victory in Georgia 4 years ago. It's a big opportunity for those of us in the climate movement this year. Georgia is where we can make a huge impact. All right, who are these people? Well, that's what I start to get at down here, and we're going to get at it in the next few slides as well. First, I just want to tell you what you're looking at here. So let's look first at this very bottom row that says reg voters. What that means is this is all registered voters in Georgia. If you look at all registered voters in Georgia, this is the demographic breakdown. 10.6% of them are 18 to 24. 19.8% are 25 to 34. And as you go along, you can see sex demographic breakdowns and racial demographic breakdowns. Thought it was important to give that to you so you would have a baseline, so you would have something to compare these low propensity environmental voters to. And that's what you see in this line that's second from the bottom that says LPEVs, that's low propensity environmental voters. So this is our target population, and this is what I want to tell you about. Who are these non-voting or infrequently voting environmentalists? Well, first off, you can see 88% of them are under the age of 35, right? 39.3 are 18 to 24, and over 48% are 25 to 34. So this population is disproportionately young. 88% of them are under 35. Whereas look, if you look at all registered voters in Georgia, that's only like 30, maybe 31% are under 35. So that's the first thing that really jumps out, is that this is a disproportionately young population that we're looking at. That probably doesn't come as a surprise to you to find out that people who care deeply about climate and the environment are young. That being said, usually it's not this stark. We don't see numbers like this in many of our other states. This is really, really young. All right. The next thing that we see is that there's a slight gender gap. I use the term gender gap. This is really sex demographic data. Voter file data is broken out by sex rather than gender. But gender gap is common parlance. And so please just know that that's what I'm referring to when I say gender gap. As you'll see, among all registered voters in Georgia, there's about a 6 percentage point gender gap. So there are 6 percentage points more women than men among registered voters in Georgia. Among these low propensity environmental voters, it's a little bit bigger. It goes up to a 9-point spread. That also is something that we see in most of our states. That actually has nothing to do with vote propensity. It isn't like women are worse voters than men. Actually, they tend to be better. What you're seeing there is that women are much more likely to list climate and the environment as their top priority. So that's where that spread is coming from. And then we see some really interesting stuff here in the racial demographic breakdowns. So among registered voters in Georgia, 51% are white, 30% are Black. Among our target population, the low propensity environmental voters, it's pretty much flipped. 49% are Black, 27% are white. So that's the first really, really big thing that stands out. You'll also see that Hispanic voters are slightly more represented in our target population. Also, Asian American and Pacific Islanders are disproportionately represented, as are Native Americans. So overall, you can see people of color are really disproportionately present among these low propensity environmental voters, especially AAPI, Black, and Native American voters. So writ large, what you see here is these low propensity environmental voters are disproportionately young, disproportionately people of color, and slightly disproportionately female. All right, where are they? Well, this is a heat map. Obviously, there are not 491,000 individual dots here. It represents where these people are. But you can see, first off, it's a very urban and close suburban population. This is where Atlanta is. And then you can see a few other urban clusters. We usually see that these environment first infrequent voters are highly urbanized. Usually it's not as stark as this. This is a very, very urban population of low propensity environmental voters. All right, a little bit on geopolitics here. Georgia has one of the most gerrymandered congressional maps you can find. The truth is, there are probably 0 competitive congressional districts in Georgia this year. But I've listed 3 that if you squint a little bit, or if things go a little bit more one way than we expect, or a little bit more another way than we expect, maybe they will be competitive. So up here, you see the Georgia 1st District. That's right down here. Republican Buddy Carter has that. That has an R+9 partisan lean. What does that mean? It means compared to the national average, looking at the last 4 national elections, so the last 2 presidentials and the last 2 midterms, the people in this district vote 9 points more Republican than the national average. We have identified almost 33,000 targets in that district. Those are the people we'll be mobilizing this year. In the 2nd congressional district down here, Sanford Bishop has that, a Democrat. That's a D+3 district. So it's a lot closer, but Sanford Bishop is a pretty strong incumbent. Most people seem to think that it still probably won't be terribly competitive, but this is something to keep an eye on. We have a huge number of targets in this district, 53,376. And then finally, the Georgia 12th up here, that's Rick Allen's district. That's R+8. And you'll see we've got almost 41,000 targets there. Here are some heat maps of those districts. So Sanford Bishop's district, way in the southwest, that was the D+3 district. That's the distribution here. You can see it's a little bit more spread out. I'm sorry, a little bit less spread out and highly urbanized than some of the others. The 12th congressional district, that was the R+8 Rick Allen district up there. And then here, the one that's in the corner, the 1st congressional district, that's like right above Jacksonville, the southeastern corner. And you've got Savannah up here. That's the spread there. If we look at the state legislative races in Georgia, there will be a decent number of competitive state house races, and maybe 1 or 2 competitive state Senate races. Obviously, anything can change. Anything can change. But I do just want to point out, these are pretty heavily gerrymandered too. In Georgia, it is unlikely that we will see any state legislature flip this year, but many of these legislative races are crucially important for fighting off veto-proof majorities and things like that. All right. Even though the congressional districts aren't that competitive, even though there aren't a lot of state legislative districts that are competitive, I do just want to finish discussing the geographic alignment and demographic alignment of these targets by reminding you of the presidential election. Georgia was decided by 11,779 votes 3.5 years ago. The Environmental Voter Project has individually identified over 491,000 super environmentalists who are already registered to vote, yet unlikely to do so without your help. And I want to be clear. We know these people by name and street address. We've got hundreds of randomized control trials telling us which messages work to turn them into consistent voters. We just need your help to make it happen. And so what we are doing is we are budgeting $1.4 million just for Georgia over the next 7 months. $1.4 million at these 490,000 voters. We hope to do digital ad campaigns and some direct mail for the May primary. But the overwhelming majority of our spending will take place this fall, and that will be robust phone campaigns, robust digital ad campaigns starting before early voting and all the way through Election Day, and a really robust direct mail campaign. We need your help. In fact, let me put it a different way. We need your investment. You are not here to help us. Many of you are wonderful friends, great volunteers, consistent donors, but dear God, I hope you don't do this because you like us at the Environmental Voter Project. I hope you're doing this not for us, but for you and your values and your goals. You are here for a reason, because you care deeply about addressing the climate crisis, you care deeply about addressing the democracy crisis, and you recognize that the next 7 months, actually even less than that, the next 210 days are everything. And I'm sorry that sounds so dramatic and I get anxious even like hearing myself say it, but come on, like we all know it's true. And so this is your opportunity to make a difference. And so I am asking you to donate. Ren is going to put a donation link in the chat. I want you to donate. Please donate and donate generously. There is no limit to the amount you can donate to us. No limit at all. Moreover, the first $100 of each donation will be matched. That being said, if you want to donate 100,000, we will take it. We will take it. You can also, when you open that donation link, check a little box for monthly donations. That really is helpful to many of you because you can spread out your donations over multiple months. It's also helpful to us when we're budgeting and we're making early spending in these primaries. And finally, I want to get to the Q&A. But if you want to host an online event over Zoom, if you think you can get 15 or 20 of your friends and colleagues together, boy, would I love to talk to them about the Environmental Voter Project. They don't need to commit to donate ahead of time. They just need to show up and learn about our work and be willing to hear me pitch this to them. And if they care deeply about all of these things, my hope is they will join us. So what we're going to do now is get to our Q&A. We've got plenty of time. We've got a good 19 minutes to answer your questions. I really look forward to it. And while we're doing this, please do open up that link in the chat and make a generous donation. Every dollar you donate through that unique chat will go right, or through that unique link rather, will go right to support our work in Georgia. All right, Ren, what do we got? We got some good questions?
Yes, we have few. And I would like to start this question from Anon. Can you please repeat the significance of the number EVP identified as low propensity voters in Georgia, and what was the 85 score you mentioned earlier?
Okay, yes. So let me just share my screen here so that we can go back and you guys can see this. Okay, so we have identified, well, we've identified slightly more than this. We've identified about 540,000 registered voters who have a greater than 85% likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their number one priority, yet they are unlikely to vote this fall. So I'm going to repeat that because I know I said a mouthful. So I said we've identified more than this. So why do I have 491,000 there? That's our treatment group. Remember, we run these things called randomized control trials so that we can set aside a control group, not talk to them, and then only communicate with our treatment group, the people who get our messaging. And then after the election, we can compare turnout in the two groups and isolate what our impact is. So these are the people we are targeting, that 491,369. And just to reiterate, who are these people? They are already registered to vote. They have a greater than 85% likelihood of not just caring about climate and the environment, but literally listing it as their number one priority. And they are unlikely to vote this fall. And the way we determined that last thing is we looked at their public voter files. They did not vote in the 2020 presidential election or any election since then. So 491,000 already registered voters who care deeply about climate and the environment, yet are unlikely to vote this fall. That's the significance both of that 491,000 number and why you heard me say 85%, because when we are targeting these people, they are probabilistic models. We determine who these voters are by determining the likelihood of them listing climate and the environment as their top priority. And we don't want to go after people who like, oh, maybe there's a 50% likelihood of them caring about climate or 60. We want it to be a really, really high level of certainty. Great question. Great question, Anand.
Thanks, Nathaniel. Second one, could you tell us why aren't all these Georgia environmentalists not voting?
Yes. Okay. Good question. Good question. Why aren't these people voting, right? Okay. So first, let me tell you some of the reasons why it's hard to answer this question with the certainty that you might look for. And then I'll get into some things that we do know. So first, let me tell you why it's hard to answer this question. Social scientists are really good at setting up experiments that tell you how to get people to do things. Like those randomized control trials I was telling you about. Those are really good at figuring out, hey, what messages get people to vote? And in the public health field, they set up experiments like this to figure out how to get people to take vaccines and things like that. What social scientists are not as good at is figuring out why people don't do things, like vote, or eat healthy, or exercise, or vaccinate themselves. That's a lot harder. Really, the only tool that we have to figure out why people aren't doing something is to ask them, is to poll them. And a funny thing happens when you do that. When you poll people and ask them, hey, why aren't you doing this thing that society views as really important, like voting? They lie their pants off. They lie their pants off. They do something, they are subject to something called social desirability bias, which essentially is when you ask people, hey, why aren't you doing this thing that you're supposed to be doing? They usually end up giving you what they think is the most socially acceptable excuse for not having done it. And so this is a long roundabout way of me saying, we don't know why environmentalists aren't voting, because whenever we ask them why they're not voting, they give us excuses that we can't really trust, because we know that most of them want to be thought of as good voters. And if you go to the Reports and Studies tab on our website, one of the very first reports, in fact, I think it is the first report we ever did, is there, and it's called something like, why do people lie about voting? And it's a really interesting study that goes into this and shows why we can't trust a lot of the excuses that people give when they say, oh, I didn't vote because of this or that or the other thing. So I encourage you to check that out. Okay, that's why it's complicated to figure this out. But let me tell you what we do know. The first thing that we know about why so many environmentalists aren't voting is that these super environmentalists are disproportionately young, they're disproportionately people of color, and they're disproportionately lower income. What do those three groups have in common? Young people, people of color, lower income people, they all vote less often. So not only do they vote less often, but they are also the groups that are always the object of voter suppression efforts. I mean, think about it. If anybody anywhere is trying to make it harder for someone to vote, chances are they are targeting young people, people of color, or lower income people. And so part of what we're seeing here is just that demographic correlation, that people who care deeply about climate and the environment happen to come from groups that vote less often, due to a whole host of matters, the biggest of which is certainly voter suppression, which is why much of our messaging is helping people figure out how they are going to vote to overcome those voter suppression efforts. So that's the first thing that we know is going on. The second thing is, for decades, even generations, I think you can say, the climate movement has been weirdly apolitical. Now, what do I mean by that? Some people like bristle when they hear me say that. Well, think of this. When I was growing up, if I thought about what it meant to be like environmentally conscious, I would probably think about like not littering or recycling. More recently, if you ask most Americans what it means to care about the climate and act on those beliefs, or to be environmentally conscious or environmentally friendly or be an environmental activist, most of them will say things like change what you eat, change how you get to work, change the electricity you consume. Now, all of these are very important, but they are also all weirdly apolitical, right? I mean, would you ever hear someone who cares deeply about reproductive rights talk that way? Or think about this. Would you ever hear someone who cares about gun control talk that way? I mean, imagine yourself. The worst of all worst things happen. There is a mass shooting that unfortunately seems to happen all the time. Do you imagine that happening? And then having people say, oh, maybe I'll reduce the number of guns that are in my own home. No, people immediately recognize that this is a political problem. It is a systemic problem that must be addressed with political means. But in the climate space and in the environmental space, we don't jump to that. We don't automatically take the political approach and the systemic approach. We often take the personal behavioral approach. And that has a lot to do with why so many environmentalists aren't voting. And I want to be clear, it's not our fault. We shouldn't feel guilty about this. It's because for decades, the fossil fuel industry has been running very sophisticated PR campaigns trying to convince us to stop paying attention to the coal-fired power plant back there and instead realize that it's all our fault for having a plastic water bottle in our hands, which is, of course, total BS, but we've bought it hook, line, and sinker. And there's no doubt, you can see all of this in polling data, that that's part of what's going on here. Most people who care deeply about climate and the environment don't view it as a political issue or a societal issue. They view it as an issue based on personal behavioral decisions. And that's a big part why so few environmentalists don't vote. Sorry, I went off on a rant there, but it was a very good question. What else we got?
I have two more, but before I ask the two next questions, I would just like to take a moment to say thank you everyone for placing your questions in the Q&A section. We really appreciate it. Nathaniel, I'll ask the two questions back to back if that's okay with you.
Sure.
The first one is from Ellen. I do want to see environmental voters voting, but I worry some, perhaps many who are current non-voters might be attracted to a certain anti-vax independent who call himself as an environmentalist. Any thoughts on RFK Jr.? The second one is that what's the requirement of the minimum for me to host my own virtual fundraising event?
Great questions. Okay, so Ellen, thank you for asking about that. So the first thing that I will say, and I hope all of you understand and respect why I'm saying this, we are a nonpartisan organization. We do not only target Democrats or Republicans or independents, nor do we ask people who they are voting for. But what I can say is this. If you look at public voting data, and in particular, one set of polling data that's really good at this is the weekly Economist YouGov poll, because it comes out every week. And not only do they ask people who they're supporting, they ask people what their number one issue priority is, and then you can cross-reference the two. What that poll consistently says week after week, now for almost 60 weeks, certainly more than a year, is a few things, Ellen, that I think you'll find interesting. The first is climate first voters break harder for Joe Biden than any other issue constituency group, bar none. Put that another way. Climate voters support Joe Biden over the other candidates more than people who list reproductive rights as their top priority, more than people who list gun rights or gun control as their top priority, more than people who list student debt relief as their top priority, more than any of it. The second thing that I will say, that percentage of climate first voters who go for Joe Biden is so big that it is even larger than the percentage of registered Democrats who say that they are going to support Joe Biden. Now, again, Ellen, I want to reiterate, the Environmental Voter Project is not allowed to ask the people we're contacting who they are voting for, and we certainly do not do that. But we have seen no evidence in any public polling that this particular population is more likely to support third-party candidates. And in fact, everything that we've seen shows that they are less likely to than other issue constituency groups. I'm not saying that your worries are not generally unfounded. I think there are a lot of young people and a lot of progressives and a lot of people who don't tend to vote who might be curious about third-party options. But none of the data that I'm seeing says that climate first voters or low propensity climate first voters are thinking that. In fact, all the data shows the opposite. Really, really good question. All right, we're going to close. I think you said that these were the last two questions, Ren. So we're going to close with the last question. If you are interested in hosting a Zoom event? What is it like? And in particular, how many people should we try to get, sort of a minimum to make it worthwhile? Well, first, let me tell you what it's like. It's a lot like this. I won't go into a lot of detail on Georgia, but you will get me, for better or for worse, you'll get me for an hour. And usually what we'll do is I'll go into depth on what EVP does, why we do it, how we do it, and our results. Then we will have, so that will usually last about 25 minutes, and then we will have a slightly longer Q&A than this. It'll be a 20 or 25-minute Q&A. It will be a meeting rather than a webinar, so everybody will be able to see each other. It will not be recorded so that we can encourage really, really frank discussion. Not that this hasn't been frank, but you know what I mean. People will not be required to donate ahead of time. It will be called a fundraiser, but they won't be required to donate ahead of time. They'll just come and hear this pitch. There will be a unique fundraising link so that anybody who donates, whether they come or not, will be tagged as one of the host's donors so that we can track that for you. And then finally, to really answer the question that was asked, how many do you want to have attend to make it worthwhile? We like to have at least 15 people attend. What we don't do is say, we want to raise at least X, because the truth is that's kind of out of hosts' control. What's more in their control is reaching out to a lot of people and getting folks to show up. And so usually what we say is if you want 15 to attend, that means you want to get 25 to RSVP and say that they'll come, because we call it a flake rate. You know, a lot of people RSVP and end up flaking. And finally, I'll just say, if you're interested, email us. Email us at info@environmentalvoter.org, or you can email me directly at nathaniel@environmentalvoter.org. And what we'll do is we'll start just by sending you a one-page document that you can look at that lays out how we run these events, what would be expected of you, what it would look like. And we handle almost all the work. The only thing you have to do is just hound the you-know-what out of your friends to show up. And I really enjoy doing them. And I think you would too. So we would love to have you do that. So please do reach out to us. We've got 2 minutes left. And so I'm going to close by just saying this. First of all, thank you so much. This is a wonderful crowd. We're enormously grateful that so many of you chose to spend your evening with us, learning about the Environmental Voter Project's work in Georgia and the enormous opportunities we see in Georgia. The second thing I will say is that Ren, again, if you wouldn't mind, please put the donation link in the chat. I ask all of you, please just click on that and open it up, because this Zoom is going to end and then the link ain't going to be there. Please just open it up. And then I will ask you to give generously. We've got 210 days until this, very important election. And I know you all care about it. I'm sorry, you've outed yourselves. We know you care about this, or else you wouldn't be here. You care deeply about the climate movement expressing its power in Georgia and elsewhere. And this happens to be one of the states where we have the biggest opportunity to make the biggest difference. So please donate generously. And there is nothing I would enjoy more than sharing our results with you in Georgia and elsewhere, because you've chosen to be part of our work. So thank you for your time this evening. Thank you for making a generous donation, and thank you for reaching out to us if you would like to host your own Zoom event. And finally, for all the volunteers who are on the line, thank you for the enormously important and impactful work you do. And thank you to Ren. Any of you volunteers know what a superstar Ren is. And Ren, thank you for running such a tight ship this evening. Take care, everybody.